think what I'd like to do today is just talk about a couple of trends. It's hard to kind of lay out and have an in-depth discussion about all the things that Admiral Kraft referred to in 30 minutes and allow for questions. So I thought I'd touch on some major themes that at least have crossed my mind or have occurred to me in part of the responses I've been involved in, but also in working with some of the new and emerging threats in the current environment we're living in right now. But let me start by just talking about the issue of complexity. We always talk about any era being an era of change. The pace of technology is always increasing. And I think that's true, and we can always define any era to be like that. But I think the rate of change, the increasing complexity that we're dealing with, including complexity in the amount of knowledge and information that potentially is available, is creating a very challenging environment for us trying to decide what it is we should do in response to threats, how we should think about them, and how we should innovate and deal with changes in that environment. So let me take you through a couple of examples, and I'll probably end up by talking about cyber and big data, which I think are probably right on the cusp of what everybody is dealing with right now. But if you look at what has happened in the last 10 or 15 years, what we've got, and I'm going to talk about natural disasters first, because they seem like they're increasing in frequency and scope and consequence. What you have is an increasing interaction between the natural environment and the human-built environment. As we populate this earth, the population gets more dense and we build out more infrastructure to support those populations, we increasingly have an interaction between what are natural weather patterns and that environment. If you add to that issues related to climate change and our need to adapt to climate change, what you're seeing is increased complexity in our natural and human-built environment. And I don't think we really understood that in the last 10 years. We have to understand it going forward, because when we built a lot of this infrastructure back during the New Deal and the Depression, we weren't thinking about things like resiliency. That's the reason there was a new dam over the Colorado River, and you don't drive over Boulder Dam anymore, between Arizona and Nevada. And the notion of national resiliency and how we think, act, do, and build, I think is becoming an imperative on how we think and moving forward. And when I think about resiliency, I tend to use the analogy of the human immune system. And when I talk about resiliency, I'm talking about the ability to understand, prepare to the extent we can, react, respond, recover, mitigate, and get on with the new normal or the continuum of our existence. That entire cycle I view as resiliency and our ability to get through that cycle and proceed on. Just like when somebody gets sick, your immune system is your defense against that. If you have a low immune system, there are far greater consequences to getting sick. And I think moving forward, when we look at national resiliency, we have to look at resiliency in those terms. I think we're going to find in reviewing the impact on the infrastructure following Hurricane Sandy in and around the East Coast and the New Jersey, New York, Connecticut area, that when we rebuild, we have to rebuild with resiliency in mind. A more resilient infrastructure that will withstand these events moving forward. And it's probably going to call into question where we build and how we build. The two most key components in looking at this moving forward are probably going to be building codes and land use. And whether or not we ought to be even populating certain areas given what we know is going to be happening with climate change and so forth. So this notion of trying to understand complexity related to resiliency as we look at the natural disasters we have to deal with, I think is really significant going forward. I think beyond that, when we start looking at the human-built environment and what we have done, there's some dramatic changes in the last 15 or 20 years that have fundamentally altered the equation on how we deal with threats, whether they're domestic threats, law enforcement threats, or terrorist threats. And the big changes are these. The internet, we all know, is a dramatic change in our life, but the internet by itself is just a means. The substantial changes that have occurred in the last 5 to 10 years, the first one is high-performance computing. The ability to disaggregate data sets and process that data in multiple places, bring that back together again, has been a remarkable breakthrough just in the last 5 or 10 years. The ability then to use machine-to-machine learning to process that data is another breakthrough. And finally, the ability to do analytics on data sets that are far bigger than we've ever envisioned is an extraordinary breakthrough in and of itself. In the most recent issue of Foreign Policy magazine, published by the Council on Foreign Relations, the cover of it for this month is the rise of big data. And And one of the things they assert in the article is that we are moving from an era where we are trying to do statistical analysis to try and predict or make decisions. We are approaching the capability to understand all the data that's relevant, that's out there. And the phrase they use in the article is N equals all. Remember you all taking stats? You had to have an N that was high enough to justify your confidence level in the statistical analysis. Now it's to the point where we can get so much data that we're actually looking for correlations, not statistically significant findings we find on analyzing the data. That is an extraordinary breakthrough that combines high-performance computing, if you add to that spectrum management, bandwidth management, the ability to fuse information, what you have, and you guys are right on the cusp of this, and what you're doing and what you're delivering to the fleet. We are creating capabilities to make it possible to more simulate real world with data. And we've always been able to approximate the real world and think about problems and model it. But we're approaching the point where it's almost like the increased pixel density that creates a higher definition picture. We're creating higher definition information by which to understand our world and model it, and then to learn and act from that. I believe as we move beyond the complexities of nuclear threats and conventional threats and traditional warfare and risks that we deal with, that we have not understood what constitutes a strategic overmatch in regards to computation, spectrum, bandwidth, and fusion. And I would submit to you that where we're lacking that most is our ability to bring that to bear on our southwest border, where we have the intersection of the ability to understand all this knowledge, but issues related to privacy and civil liberties as we start to cross into our borders. And because of that, I think one of our big, I wouldn't call it a failure, because in fact I'm not sure how I would characterize it, but we have failed to achieve and act on a strategic overmatch in those areas against our adversaries. Now, why is that important? Because the man-made threats that we deal with, and I'm talking about transnational organized crime and illicit trafficking, and the threat finance associated with that links normal criminal activity to terrorist activities. And if you're going to deal with any threat, whether it's a smuggling threat, drug threat, human trafficking threat, or a terrorist threat, there are certain things the bad guys got to do. They have to move, they have to talk, and they have to spend money. All of that is susceptible to better analysis, exploitation, and discovery through these strategic overmatches that we have right now. The question is, are we organized and capable of doing it? I would submit to you we're doing a pretty good job inside the military and inside the intelligence community. We learned in handling the IED threat in Iraq and Afghanistan what we had to do. Because of that, we have a giant echoic right now that's fusing that information and reversed a very disturbing trend of losing lives and attacked that problem. And we all know we would not have got Osama bin Laden without the ability to fuse that information, put it in the cloud, and exploit it. Where the hard part comes is trying to take that concept and move it into a non-military, non-intelligence community area where you're dealing with law enforcement sensitive information, open source information, and then bring that to bear to find, fix, and finish the problems that operate outside the Title X environment. And the problem we have there is we collect information based on statutory authorities of agencies we're created to deal with one threat vector. Alcohol, tobacco, firearms, drugs, intellectual property, pornography, or whatever. And as a result, we are having a hard time seeing what that combined set of knowledge and data can tell us and help us in dealing with these threats. And the problem with that is that the bad guys are not constrained, and they will go to the most effective means they have to produce financing to perpetuate their regimes, if you will, or their organizations. And they don't organize themselves like, we're going to violate ATF rules today, we're going to violate DEA rules today. They're generating cash. And we're going to have to learn how to put that data together and transcend the traditional authorities and jurisdictions and even appropriations limits of the various law enforcement agencies and put that together, because otherwise we are not attacking a network with a network, and we're failing to achieve the strategic overmatch that's offered by those changes in technology that I discussed. Okay, that's on the technology side. On the real world side, and we were talking before we came in, There is no large complex problem, and I talked about complexity. There is no large complex problem that we deal with today in this world that is susceptible to being solved by one particular agency, private sector company, not-for-profit group, or any entity, if you will. In the government, there are always going to be restrictions by authorizing legislation and appropriations and resources. And the problems that we deal with are so complex they cross boundaries. There is no complex problem we deal with in this world today that can be solved by one single entity. And when you cross boundaries, and you're not living in the Title X world, where you have unity of command, and you can compel compliance to an order, then you have to deal with a coalition of the willing, or you have to figure out some way to organize and make that effective. And the challenge we've had since the creation of the Department of Homeland Security in 2003 is to be able to create unity of effort. Not unity of command, but unity of effort across not only the interagency, but the private sector, faith-based organizations, non-governmental organizations, and so forth. And it is an increasing leadership skill, coordinating skill that's going to have to be developed in all of us if we're going to be successful. So let me give you an example of how this cross-cuts. A little bit of a sea story, Katrina sea story. You all know that Hurricane Katrina came ashore on the 29th of August, 2005. And in the next week, we all watched various degrees of angst, despair, and horror in some cases, what happened at the Superdome and the Convention Center. On Thursday that week, I had just been in a meeting at the Pentagon where there was a discussion on whether or not they should invoke the Insurrection Act or seek to waive posse comitatus and basically militarize the entire situation. And there was a deliberate, intentional decision not to do that, because in this country, disaster response is the purview of the local authorities. It's an application of the 10th Amendment. All powers not granted to the federal government are reserved to the state. There was not a legal premise to preempt the authorities of the mayor and the governor down there. So the problem was, what's going on? How do we fix it? How do we deal with this problem? I was contacted late Thursday by the military advisor to Secretary Chertoff, and they asked me if I would go down to New Orleans and assist Mike Brown. For reasons unknown to me, and someday I'll have to sit down and talk to the president or Fran Townsend or somebody, I said I would go, and I was called on Monday after Labor Day, the weekend. So there must have been some deliberative process about what they might do, could do, or what legally they were empowered to do. On Monday morning, the 5th of September, I was called by Secretary Chertoff, and they asked me to go down and become the Deputy Principal Federal Official to Mike Brown. I flew to Baton Rouge that night, and when I flew to New Orleans the next morning, it was a scene of utter devastation. Even though it was a week later, there were still helicopters buzzing around. There was still search and rescue going on. At that point, people were coming out of the city because they couldn't bear to stay under those conditions with the heat. No water, no electricity, no sewage, and so forth. I realized in flying in over the city, at least in my mind, why we had gotten this wrong. And I'm dealing with I have a harder time explaining this to another crowd, but this will be pretty easy for you guys. We are used to having a problem identified, coming up with some kind of an objective, a mission statement, a concept of operations, operating plans, time phase deployment, application of training, TTP, after action report, lessons learned, and so forth. The direction I got was go to New Orleans. In case you're wondering what my direction was. And when I flew in over the city, I realized why we had gotten to the situation we were in. We had been treating this entire event as if it were a hurricane, and the 10th Amendment applied, which means pursuant to a disaster declaration, you send money to the state, and the state is responsible for coordinating getting those resources down. And for a week, we flowed in resources. The Coast Guard self-deployed down there and saved 33,000 people. We had urban search and rescue teams. We had state policemen for mutual assistance packs. We had the National Guard from the state of Louisiana and other states were all there. What I realized when I flew in over the city was that we weren't dealing with a hurricane anymore, and that was not the right answer. So if you're thinking about innovation and how to deal with these problems, you've got to start with getting the event right. So here's Alan's definition of the event, and I'll break it down for you. What happened in New Orleans after the hurricane passed through and we had the flooding was the equivalent of a weapon of mass effect used on the city without criminality. Let me break that down. Had terrorists blown the levees and flooded the city, we would have the same situation we have in Boston right now. They don't know what's going on, but there's a presumption it could likely be terrorism, and the FBI is leading. There's federal preemption over the event itself. Now, there's likely to be consequence management, and there is, and there would be in any major event. But there would have been a federal premise to override local authorities and manage the event. That didn't exist. There was no criminal or terrorist act associated with what happened. But we had the same effect or consequences, which was the equivalent of a weapon of mass effect used on the city that resulted in a loss of continuity of government. The real problem was, as of the 29th of August, they lost continuity of government. And no amount of resources sent pursuant to a Stafford Act declaration can fix that. So for a week, resources flowed in, problems arose that could not be handled because the city didn't have the resources or the command and control capability to apply them to any mission effect. Okay? Once I got that, I said, okay, what are you going to do about it? So the goal at that point became to recreate the elements of civil society or what government needs to carry out their responsibility, and then let the federal government assist them in doing that. So what we did was, the day that I got there, the Iwo Jima pulled in. You all remember they set it down. There was a platform that we used. And Russ Honore had been in town about the day before. I think a lot of you know Russ. So we sat down and we both agreed that's the problem. So what are we going to do about it? We had a mayor with no resources around him and no capability and capacity. So the first thing we decided was there would be no air gap between the two of us. And in our parlance, I was the supporting commander, he was the supporting commander. And even as a supporting commander, my goal was to try and make the federal government assist the mayor and the governor. We then divided the city up into sectors, and we assigned each sector to one of Russ Honore's components. So the 82nd Airborne got the Central Business District. The lower 9th Ward and St. Bernard's Parish were the victims of what I call the hat trick. They had the initial storm surge that flooded them. The levees failed and back flooded the lower 9th Ward. Then they had a 1 million-gallon oil tank at Murphy Oil Refinery, came off its base and slimed the whole place. It was so awful we gave that to the Marines. Then what we did was we took teams of about 20 or 30 people, rubber boats, high water vehicles, security, communications, logistics, all the support we needed for local police officers and state policemen to go door to door and touch every building in the city. We called it a hasty sweep. And you saw the results. We spray painted the symbols and kept track. While the water went down, we did 3 sweeps of the city so we could account for anybody that remained to be saved and start the very difficult problem of remains removal. Okay. Once we understood what the problem was and what we needed to do, we presented plans every day to the city saying, here is our approach for tomorrow. And if they didn't like it, we would change it. Now, whether that's putting a fig leaf or maybe a shamrock over the insurrection act of Posse Comitatus, that's what we did. That's how we made it work. We had no legal authority to direct some of this stuff, so we had to create a coalition of the willing to provide the capability and capacity, which is what they needed for the mayor to execute his legal responsibilities. Okay? So one of the things you need to take away from in the complex issues we're dealing with today, it's harder than ever to get the problem statement correct. If you don't get the problem statement correct, you're likely not applying the resources to the right areas, you're not going to get the performance you want, and you're likely going to be failing. There's an added dimension of this complexity, and that's there's an expectation of our public in the United States now that we will have a whole of community or a whole of government response. That flies in the face of the boundaries I mentioned earlier that constrain agencies on what they can do in terms of authorities and resources. And it's been made worse by the digital world we live in. I mean, if you're like us, my wife and I rarely go to a store at Christmas anymore. You know, we order things online. You all have our devices. And I can watch NFL football from my phone when I'm traveling. We're so immersed in this, and there's such an immediacy of our request for good services or whatever. I think sometimes the public does not understand when there's an event, the government has not moved that fast, does not ingest technology that quickly, does not turn it around, which is the reason you all exist, by the way. I'm telling you anything you don't know. And I think there's a widening gap between what the public believes the art of the possible to be, that feeds their expectation of what the art of the possible should be for a whole of government, a whole of community response, and the ability of the country to react to that. And I think that gap is widening, because we never have an honest discussion about what the limits of government are, and there are intended to be limits on government. And our procurement laws, our acquisition, privacy, civil liberties laws all constrain us to the ability to act this quickly. It's really funny, we talk about personal data and biometrics and intrusions. I haven't been there a long time, but this last month I took my grandkids for the first time to Orlando. I'm still standing, so that's good. When you go into Universal Studios in Orlando, you know what they do? They give you a card, and the first time you go in, they take your right index fingerprint, and they match you going in and out of the park the rest of the time you're there. Nobody says a word. Yeah, here's my fingerprint. I went into the park. If you made that the price of admission to do certain things from government, there'd be general organ rejection by the entire community. So we're dealing with this discontinuity of expectations about what the art of the possible is and what government should do. So let me get to the last part and go to some questions. You can keep me on track on this time here. What does that mean to us as leaders? How we make decisions, how we apply resources, and how we attack these complex problems in the face of an increasingly skeptical public that believes they know the art of the possible. And the final complicating factor is we will never have another large event in the country again that does not involve public participation. I'm talking about in the operations themselves. As we found out yesterday, the first information coming out of the scene is usually somebody that's got a video camera or a phone. And then 20 minutes later, they're on with CNN having a discussion about it. And sometimes this is going on while we're still deploying forces, having people respond before there's even an outcome to the response. Not only is it being evaluated by the public, but the public is actually in the environment. I remember we were all aghast when we went ashore in Mogadishu. Was that been 10 or 15 years ago now? And CNN was watching us come ashore. We thought that was amazing. It's way beyond that now. If you add into social media, what happens is people can actually intrude into the operational space, produce behaviors in the operational space, and they don't have to be physically present. They can aggregate on social media to produce behaviors without being in each other's presence. It's not going away, folks. In my view, what's happened on the internet and social media is the sociological equivalent of climate change. And John Holder, the Science Technology Advisor of the President, said there are 3 ways to deal with climate change. You suffer, you adapt, or you manage. I think that's where we're at with social media and open source information as we move forward. So that is, when I talk about complexity, that's the type of environment I'm talking about. That puts a premium on developing leaders that can innovate, that can cooperate, that can network and collaborate, work across boundaries, and create a vision, a way forward, a path where people can subscribe to without having sometimes legal authority to do that. Create a shared vision that results in unity of effort. Not easily achieved, but unless we have leaders that can understand those types of problems and the environment surrounding those problems, and then bring that to bear and how they lead, we're going to continue to be a substandard in our response in the eyes of the American public. Now, I think your mission here is right on. I just made the case for your command. Shift that to the military environment and the things that you're working on, and remote sensing, some of the detection stuff you're working with, how you're able to put synthetic learning out, all this stuff. But that is the right way to attack complexity. It's to make it knowable, make it transparent, and then put the knowledge out in the hands of the people that have to make decisions so they're more effective in assessing what's going on. Because you're always going to be making decisions under conditions of uncertainty, compressed time frames with incomplete information. The more you can fill out those missing elements of that model, the more effective we're going to be either as responders in a natural disaster or as war fighters. So I thank you for what you're all doing here. Have I come close to my 30 minutes?
I have 5 more minutes and then we'll take questions.
Okay, good. Well, let me hit a couple other things then. The ability to take lessons learned and move them forward. I'm going to give you one really good example of a lesson learned and my interaction with President Obama on it, and that'll probably lead us into the questions. I had a huge problem during the Gulf oil spill in trying to create a common operating picture, get all the data and knowledge that we needed, and then queue resources to where we needed them. Because what we had was a private company that had its own information system. We had the interagency team that was working the problem. We had huge capabilities that NOAA, EPA, Coast Guard, and others had. But the ability to bring that together and fuse it into a common operating picture to create situational awareness was really, really challenging. And I forgot that you should always step back and say, what is the problem, what is I'm trying to solve? So if I can go back a year or two before, one of the breakthrough decisions that we made in our response to the Haitian earthquake was to negotiate with the Haitian government and take control of the airspace. In the first 24 hours following, if you remember, the only way into Port-au-Prince was a 10-hour drive from Santo Domingo by convoys. The port collapsed on itself. And in the first 24 hours, I think there were maybe 12 landings on that strip. Secretary Clinton went down and negotiated with the government of Haiti to allow us to take over the airspace for 72 hours. We did it out of Tyndall at Konar. And at the height of the operations, we were moving 160 aircraft a day in and out of that airport. Because we were managing the slots. We basically took the entire interagency. We didn't tip fit them, but we got as close as we could. And then you put FEMA people in USAID and understand where the foreign aid was coming in and managing the slots. In my view, is one of the keys to what I thought was a very, very credible response in Haiti. And we got into early June, and I was running into a real problem with situational awareness on this oil spill business, and it was vastly complicated by the decision of BP to use vessels of opportunity to employ local fishermen and increase the response capability. The fact of the matter is, bringing those vessels of opportunity in is something I would not recommend again. But at the time, it seemed like a good idea to BP for the politics and the revenue being generated. But the ability to control all those folks was extraordinary, because at one point we had 7,000 of them. And it was kind of like, I tell everybody, it was kind of like the folks that showed up at Lexington before the Revolutionary War. They showed up with passion, resources, and commitment. But some of them had a musket and some of them had a knife. Some of them didn't have anything. We had to form those people up and beat the British. Well, that was our vessels of opportunity in the oil spill. So I went down with the president to Pensacola, Florida. I think it was on the 12th of June. On the way back, he was going to address the nation in the Oval Office that night. And we're in Air Force One up front. Got airborne, and the president does what he always does once he relaxes and nobody's around. He plays spades with his staff, in case you wanted to know. Like spades. And obviously, there were four of them playing, and I was the fifth, so I went and sat outside, and I was having a cup of coffee talking to the Air Force sergeant who was running the galley. And somebody bumped into me. I looked up, and it was the president. He sits down, and I'm going, okay, performance counseling. He gets about this far away from my nose, and he goes, do you have enough resources? And I said, Mr. President, it's not an issue of resources at this point between BP and the U.S. government. We got deep pockets. I've got a real problem with the industrial base. You cannot produce enough boom in this country to simultaneously completely ring 5 states with Republican governors in advance of midterm elections. But you need to hold me accountable, do the best I can, and if I don't, you need to fire me. He said, what do you need? I said, Mr. President, I made a mistake because I forgot a lesson learned I should have learned. Because he was with me. I was with him, I'm sorry, in the situation room following the Haitian response. And I said, I need to take control of the airspace. We'd had 8 near mid-air collisions, the spotter planes and everything else. We had these vessels out there that we didn't know where they were, and we couldn't tell them where the oil was. I said, the only way I can do this safely and effectively is I need to take control of the airspace. He says, what do you need to do? I said, well, I'm going to call Mike Mullen in the morning. I'm going to talk to Nordy Schwartz. I'm going to talk to, Sandy out of Northcom. We're going to make this happen. But that's what I need to do. If I need something from you, I need to tell him. I talked to the president. We're going to do it. And he leans over and he got even about this far from my nose. He goes, okay, Thad, but there are no do-overs. I got that, Mr. President. The next morning, I got up and I wrote about a 12-page email, and I also started changing the doctrine of our response to match the scale of the effort, which was way over what Incident Command was intended to do. And we slowly got our arms around it, we kept the well moving forward. But operating in these kind of environments where you have to think quickly, you have to challenge assumptions, challenge existing mental models. What have I forgotten? Have We learned everything we can learn from the past events, and can we apply that rapidly to improve our performance moving forward?